Join us on a chilling journey from New Jersey to Australia as we explore the most disturbing abandoned asylums and uncover the horrors committed within. What dark secrets lie behind the crumbling walls of abandoned asylums? In the 19th century, mental health reformers aimed to replace overcrowded shelters with sprawling facilities, but what they created often became nightmarish places of suffering. In response to the abuse and stigma faced by those with mental illnesses, doctors established asylums designed as sprawling estates, offering amenities like sustainable farms and entertainment centers. These facilities promised progressive treatments, but the reality often turned nightmarish. Despite their initial promise, overcrowding, societal isolation, and a limited understanding of mental health led these asylums to become sites of torture. Patients suffered through brutal treatments such as ice baths, electric shock therapy, bloodletting, straitjackets, and even lobotomies. As society's understanding of mental health evolved, these psychiatric hospitals were eventually shut down. Today, many of these abandoned asylums stand in ruins, victims of decades of neglect. Their brutal histories have led many to believe they might be haunted. Today, healthcare professionals refrain from using the terms mental asylum or insane asylum, and instead refer to these institutions as psychiatric facilities. But at the turn of the century, mental asylum was common parlance. In the early 20th century, abuse against patients in these mental asylums was rampant, but few places were as violent as the Philadelphia State Hospital at Byberry, where multiple homicides were later uncovered. The facility opened in 1903 as a working farm for the mentally ill, and patients from other overcrowded mental health hospitals were sent there to heal. But the humble treatment facility quickly became overcrowded itself and was expanded into a multi-campus hospital. The hospital's ballooning number of patients made it difficult to recruit qualified staff, so the facility hired non-medically trained individuals to bridge the gaps. This indiscriminate hiring practice produced staff that was ill-equipped to handle patients with mental illnesses and who often resorted to violence. In 1919, 2 orderlies confessed to strangling a patient until his eyes popped out and then blamed their actions on PTSD from World War I. Despite their confession, the 2 orderlies were kept on staff and even given a pay raise. And this violence continued for years. In 1989, a groundskeeper stumbled upon the corpses of at least 2 other patients. Violence between patients was just as common. At least one staffer reported witnessing a patient stabbing another patient with a sharpened spoon in 1944. In 1987, a female patient was raped and murdered. Her body was finally found after staff noticed patients carrying her teeth. The hospital's history of violence first made its way to the public in a 1946 Life magazine expose, and then again in the early 1980s when it was dubbed a clinical and management nightmare. Even though Pennsylvania Governor Robert Casey ordered the facility to be closed in 1987, the hospital didn't officially close its doors until 1990. Today, the abandoned asylum still stands as a frightening reminder of the horrors that once took place there. In October 1867, the sprawling Beechworth Lunatic Asylum was opened in Australia. The facility was built on a hill due to the erroneous belief at the time that high altitude could cleanse patients of their mental illnesses. As was typical of early institutions, the abandoned asylum took in a massive number of patients. At its peak, it housed about 1,200 patients and employed 700 staff members. Also, like most facilities of the 19th century, the treatments at Beechworth were notoriously violent. Doctors subjected patients to straitjackets and shackles. Electroshock treatments were common practice there, so much so that there were reportedly mass shock sessions where nearly the entire patient population was shocked simultaneously. Given the extent of the mistreatment that took place at the asylum, it may not come as a surprise that the facility, which was finally closed in 1995, is said to be extremely haunted. Those who worked at the hospital during its last years allege that the hauntings began long before the hospital was shuttered. One common spooky sighting is the ghost matron Sharp, who once worked at the asylum. She is said to have shown kindness to the patients and tried to improve their conditions. Later nurses allege that she returned as a spirit whose presence was marked by a sudden chill in the room. She would reportedly stand watch over patients as nurses shocked them. Other ghosts have allegedly been spotted by visitors during haunted tours around the abandoned asylum, which now sits empty and untouched in the same spot it was built over 150 years ago. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum first opened its doors to patients in 1863 in West Virginia. The now-abandoned asylum was the brainchild of Thomas Kirkbride, an American mental health professional who advocated for more humane and holistic treatments for mental health patients. While a holistic approach to mental health is embraced today, it was unheard of in Kirkbride's time. Kirkbride's philosophy was simple: give patients a supportive and comfortable environment with access to fresh air and sunlight so that they can recover from their illness. When it first opened, it seemed like the facility was on track with its reformist ideals. The 250-bed hospital was equipped with a long and spacious hallway adorned by high windows and ceilings. Each patient had their own private room to sleep in, and there were outdoor facilities that included a working farm, waterworks, a dairy farm, a gas well, and a cemetery. Yet, over the years, something sinister began to brew behind the asylum's doors. In 1881, the institution became overcrowded with an influx of patients as mental health diagnoses and the stigma surrounding the disease increased. By 1950, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum found its tranquil facilities overrun, housing almost 500 more patients than it was meant to. At its peak, over 2,600 patients were living at the facility. Overcrowding led to a severe decline in quality care for the patients. Patients were left to roam through the hospital unsupervised and frequently went without treatment or food, and even lived in their own filth. The hospital itself physically deteriorated due to negligence. But what was most disturbing of all were the treatments given to patients at the abandoned asylum. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was the site of an experimental lobotomy laboratory run by Walter Freeman, an American surgeon who was a notorious advocate for the controversial medical practice. It's estimated that he performed 4,000 lobotomies using his ice pick method, which involved slipping a thin pointed rod into the patient's eye socket and then severing the connective tissue in the brain's prefrontal cortex with a hammer. The horrors inside the Virginia asylum remained largely unknown to the public until 1949, when a bombshell report published by the Charleston Gazette unveiled the facility's conditions. But the asylum continued to operate long after this expose and was finally shut down for good in 1994. Italy's Ospedale Psichiatrico di Volterra, or the Psychiatric Hospital of Volterra, is likely the country's most notorious abandoned asylum. The Ospedale was first established in 1888 inside a poorhouse that was operated under the former convent of San Girolamo, where a section was dedicated solely to see to patients living with mental illnesses. The facility was later taken over by Dr. Luigi Scabbia, who greatly expanded it and turned it into a veritable village. The asylum at Volterra was meant to be a sort of haven where patients could roam and do as they pleased. There were shops, a guarding company, and a judicial section, which became known as the Ferry Pavilion. But the hospital's idyllic objective was sidelined after the facility became overcrowded. By the 1960s, the Ospedale Psichiatrico di Volterra was one of the country's most populated hospitals with more than 6,000 patients. This was largely due to how easy it was to be committed to the hospital, and patients were admitted on the faintest signs of depression to accusations of moral transgressions. The facility was run like a prison, with nurses being referred to as guards or supervisors. Patients were treated like inmates and often sedated or isolated. The cures they were given included electroshock treatments, insulin-induced comas, and ice tank submersions. Patients at the Volterra facility suffered immensely until the hospital was abandoned in 1978 following the passage of the Bisceglie Law, which mandated the closure of all mental hospitals in Italy. Today, the ruins of the abandoned asylum still exist and bear the markings of its most famous patient, Fernando Oris Nanetti. He was an artist who covered parts of the facility with elaborate graffiti during his stay. Among Nanetti's most famous artworks is a 590-foot piece of plastered wall which he covered in etchings that reflected his feelings, ideas, and even the abuses he witnessed at the asylum. Nanetti stayed at Volterra for decades before he was transferred to another local facility in the 1970s. Some of his artistic yet disturbing musings can still be seen among the asylum's ruins, like a silent memorial to Voltaire's forgotten patience. Like nearly all of the mental facilities of its time, the Willard Asylum for the Chronic Insane was meant to be a forward-thinking treatment facility when it welcomed its first patient in 1869. And just like the other abandoned asylums on this list, its mission was destroyed by overcrowding. The hospital was proposed by New York Surgeon General Sylvester D. Willard, who was an advocate for mental health policy reform, and it was approved by President Abraham Lincoln just 6 days before he was assassinated. Willard was a state-of-the-art facility that featured a gymnasium, arts and crafts classes, a movie theater, and even a bowling alley. It was meant to be a place where people living with mental illnesses could either devote themselves to their recovery or live in a safe and active environment. One of the hospital's main missions was to treat patients with the goal of preparing them to rejoin society. Despite this ideal, the hospital fell victim to the incomplete ideas and harsh treatments of its day. Patients were still subjected to electroshock therapy and ice baths, and some patients were kept at the asylum until their deaths. Many were buried under unmarked tombstones that stilled the abandoned asylum's grounds. The hospital was finally shut down in 1995. Perhaps most tragic about the asylum's history, however, was the discovery of hundreds of suitcases that were found cataloged in the hospital's attic upon its closure. These were the belongings of patients who died in the hospital and were unclaimed by next of kin. The staff was apparently unable to throw these mementos away. Head to the small town of Coquitlam, British Columbia, and you will find one of the most endangered heritage sites of Canada, according to the Heritage Canada Foundation. It is the Riverview Hospital, a now-defunct mental asylum that was first built in the early 1900s. The territory of the abandoned asylum covers 247 acres of land, where a number of buildings that make up the hospital are located. The first building erected was the West Lawn Pavilion, which was opened in 1913 and housed the region's most psychologically disturbed male patients. This section of the hospital was closed in 1983. With daunting pillars and a dilapidated front porch, it is now the most photographed section of the abandoned asylum. But the rest of the abandoned hospital is just as haunting to see. The Riverview Hospital was originally intended to serve a dual function as a mental health facility for the patient overflow from Victoria's Royal Jubilee Hospital and as a botanical garden for British Columbia. There was a ubiquitous belief at the time that access to nature and sunlight was the primary antidote for mental illness. Eventually, however, the idea was scrapped, and the official botanical garden was moved to the University of British Columbia. The Riverview Hospital, which housed over 4,300 patients in the 1950s, holds a terrifying past. Though the number of patients declined due to the advancement of mental health medication, the harmful practices that were used at the facility continued until as late as the early aughts when the hospital was still in operation. Reports revealed that the hospital still employed electroshock therapy in the 21st century and allegedly illegally sterilized a number of patients. In 2005, 9 women received settlements totaling $450,000 following a joint lawsuit filed against the facility over the alleged sterilizations. The hospital was finally closed in 2010. These days, the abandoned asylum is allegedly haunted and has become a popular filming location for supernatural-themed productions like The X-Files, Supernatural, and Watchmen. When it comes to abandoned asylums with devastating histories, Wales' Denbigh Insane Asylum is in a class of its own. The facility was built between 1844 and 1848 and is located in North Wales, where it was supposed to serve as a treatment facility for about 200 Welsh-born patients. But like many asylums built during this period, the hospital was expanded to accommodate spillover from other hospitals. At its peak, Denbigh housed as many as 1,500 patients. Patients at Denbigh were infamously subjected to prefrontal lobotomies. More than 20 patients were selected for lobotomies between 1942 and 1944, and one patient even died from the procedure. Patients that were considered violent were also allegedly put in cages. In 1960, The asylum's notorious reputation led to its foreclosure on the orders of British Member of Parliament, Enoch Powell. But the hospital continued trudging along until it was shut down for good in 1995. The now-abandoned asylum is a popular site for thrill-seekers and photographers. Matthew Grocute, a photographer who took a number of portraits inside of the defunct hospital, has even asserted that the facility is actually haunted. "It was by far the creepiest place I have ever been into," he said. "There were so many strange noises emanating from the buildings that I really didn't want to wander too far from my companion. At one point we both heard what sounded like a groan and just stopped and stared at each other. I don't believe in ghosts, but I didn't want to hang around." Sanatorio Duran has a long and sad history. It was reportedly first opened as a tuberculosis hospital in 1918 by a Costa Rican doctor named Carlos Duran Carton, whose daughter was suffering with the disease. But according to another origin story, Carton's daughter actually contracted the disease after the sanatorium was opened. What's known for certain, however, is that Carton's beloved daughter died shortly after the hospital was opened. The sanatorium continued its operations, and it was mostly run by nuns from the nearby Sisters of Charity Santa Ana. Like many tuberculosis facilities of the early 20th century, Sanatorio Duran also began welcoming other kinds of patients, including those living with mental illnesses. Specialized hospitals like Sanatorio Duran were also often transformed into unofficial prisons. Hospitals of this time were largely viewed as spaces where individuals who were deemed undesirable could live together and apart from society. As a result, patients sick with contagious diseases were kept alongside people living with mental illnesses, and those with disabilities were housed alongside criminals. By the early 1960s, tuberculosis treatment began to make progress and the hospital began to see fewer patients, and those with mental illnesses were moved to bigger psychiatric facilities. After all the patients were moved out, the hospital was converted into both an orphanage and a prison. It continued to operate for another decade before it was completely shut down. Today, the building sits in decay, thanks in no small part to the eruption of the Irazu volcano in December 1994. The abandoned asylum is now considered one of the most haunted sites in all of Costa Rica, with many claiming that they can still hear and feel the spirits of the people who died there. The Hagedorn Psychiatric Hospital, located on Sanatorium Road in New Jersey, is among the most chilling sights in the state. The hospital was first built in 1907 as a tuberculosis sanatorium and was owned and operated by the state. It was supposed to be a model institution for tuberculosis care with a mission to treat only the curable, so those with severe cases were unable to be admitted. Between 1907 and 1929, about 10,000 patients sought treatment at the facility. But as the years went by, Hagedorn's original mission was broadened to include those who were deemed incurable. The hospital operated until the 1970s when it fell into disrepair and was abandoned. Then, in 1977, the government erected a new psychiatric facility right next door to the abandoned site. The psychiatric facility was named after State Senator Garrett W. Hagedorn and was built as an extension to the defunct tuberculosis center. The so-called Senator Garrett W. Hagedorn Geropsychiatric Hospital was a 288-bed facility and a state nursing home designed specifically to treat elderly patients who lived with a mental illness. Patients of varying ages were later admitted to the facility, but the new psychiatric hospital didn't last for long. With a growing movement that shifted away from institutionalization, both private and state-run mental health facilities began to close down. In 2012, New Jersey Governor Chris Christie officially shut Hagedorn down, and it has been left abandoned ever since. At the time of its closure, Hagedorn was still treating roughly 300 people with mental illnesses and elderly patients. These abandoned asylums serve a larger purpose than morbid fascination. They also stand as a memorial to all the people who suffered inside them before safer, more humane alternatives were discovered.